Right, good evening all. I think we're just about getting everybody in the room, so I suggest we make a start. So the good news is that we do not expect any testing of the fire alarm today, but just in case we have to inconvenience you, we would like you to be prepared. So if you do hear the alarm go, it will be for real, and we need to evacuate the building promptly and calmly through the nearest emergency exit. Our assembly point is underneath Waterloo Bridge. If we can return to the building, our speakers will choose the nearest pub to continue the debate on electrification policy. So I suspect there are quite a few people tonight attending one of these lectures for the first time. Can I see a show of hands if you've been to one of our lectures, if you haven't been to one of our lectures before? Yeah, quite a few. So I'll introduce myself so you know who to address your complaints to. My name is Xenophon Christodoulou. I'm currently the chair of the IET London Network and your host for the evening. I'm a fellow of the IET and a volunteer, not a member of staff. So just reduce your expectations a little bit. I'm not getting paid to do this. So I hope you all managed to get a bite to eat and drank enough coffee to stay alert to the end. You don't want to be picked up by the IET seat snooze detection system. You'll find out if you do. So for those that are attempting to join us online, we do have live streaming on the event tonight on our YouTube channel. And we're taking on questions and comments through Twitter and YouTube chat. We've got people monitoring it. I hope the technology is working. We tested it before, it was working fine. So please send your questions through our Twitter account and YouTube channel, and we'll try and address them all. This would be a good time also to switch your phones off. So sit back, relax over the next hours or so, and enjoy the evening. For those that are again here for the first time, so this is part of a monthly evening lecture we organize every second Wednesday by the IET Central London Network. As I said, the network is run by a committee of volunteers. There's quite a few around, and you see them at the registration desk. The presentation tonight will last approximately for an hour, and then we've allowed half an hour for questions. So I'd like to ask you to keep your questions for the end. You get plenty of opportunity. Following the presentation, we've organized a drinks reception, and I hope to see you all there for some good old-fashioned networking and for an informal chat with the speakers. Tonight's event is a collaboration with the Railway Industry Association and the IMechE, as you may have seen from the flyers. We're honored to have with us David Clark, Technical Director of the Railway Industry Association, and Andy Melos, Managing Director at South West Trains. The session will be chaired by Ian Flynn, Technical Director at Synergy Rail, and also a member of the IMechE Railway Committee. That's correct, Ian, isn't it? So I'm just going to invite Ian to introduce the speakers and kick off the event for tonight. Thank you.
So thanks for coming, ladies and gentlemen. We're certainly enjoying the irony of coming as mechanical engineers to the IET to talk about electrification. But it's an important topic, and I guess that along with Ria, so I'm as Zen has said, the chair of the IMechE Events Committee of the Railway Division of the IMechE, and David, who you'll be hearing from in a second, is Technical Director at Ria. And Ria and the IMechE have come together in a series of events, of which this is one, really stepping slightly outside our comfort zone perhaps, and making a direct attempt to hopefully influence policy in the area of electrification, because we think it's taken a wrong turn over the last few years for reasons which I think the speakers will be able to articulate. So we are going to have a question and answer session at the end. Hopefully people all over the world able to participate, but we'll be putting a premium on questions, really trying to address the conundrums of railway electrification, indeed railway policy around powering vehicles, because I think we believe in the institutions and in RIA that fundamental engineering principles can't be ignored by policymakers. Too often As we know, they reach senior management who are not technical, and politicians and others reach for simplistic solutions, but ignoring the fundamental physics, which actually underpins our railway systems, and the fundamental engineering. And we're hoping to go through some of those issues today. So looking forward to the conversation at the end, and hopefully it will be a conversation. And also, it would absolutely be remiss of me not to mention that on the 5th of June, so in about a month's time, we've got a fantastic event at Birdcage Walk with these two guys, plus a whole bunch of other speakers, all of them experts in the field and well-known figures from around the industry, who will be really painting quite a vivid picture about where electrification sits today in 2019, and what the industry collectively thinks we should do about where we are, and how we can actually get ourselves to a position where electric trains powered by renewable energy is the de facto means of mass transport in the country. So without further ado, David, introduce David Clark, once again, Technical Director of RIA. Thank you. Oh, I got that wrong. I only got 50-50 chance of getting it right, and I blew it. So, and Andy Mellors is going to start. Andy's the Managing Director of the South Western Railway, and erstwhile Engineering Director at the time on Great Western when IEP trains were introduced. Of course, IEP's famous hybrid trains with diesel and electric power. So a wonderful piece of engineering, fantastic piece of engineering, but not actually funded to go all the way to the cities in the west of the country. And Andy is also, as his badge proudly says, President of the Institution of Locomotive Engineers. So in that capacity, I invite you to the podium.
Thank you, Ian. It's great to be here. As Ian says, not only am I the MD of South Western Railway, an almost wholly electrified network actually, but this year I'm the chair of the Railway Division of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, which the Institution of Locomotive Engineers, which is the medallion that I get to have for my year in office, originates from that particular institution, which 50 years ago was incorporated into the IMechE as the Railway Division. But this particular medallion, I think, dates back to just prior to the First World War, so I have to keep good care of it. So it's great to be here this evening to talk through some of the challenges of rail electrification, drawing on my experience in my previous role at Great Western, and also in my current role to really give a train operator's insight into what is going on out there. So the things I'm going to go through this evening, societal expectations, how is the world in which we live changing, particularly in terms of expectations, in terms of environmental credentials, some of the issues associated with the decarbonisation challenge. And I want to focus quite a bit on what our customers actually want and what the implications of that therefore are for the rolling stock engineer. So I'll start 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, with the Climate Change Act from 2008 and some of the things that were set in legislation at the time in terms of target levels for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So the target for 2050 was to reduce by at least 80% compared to 1990 levels, and that legislation has actually cemented the UK's position as an international leader in climate change. And the UK has been making some good progress towards that, as you can see from that final point in terms of performance in respect of the first two carbon budgets. But the next 10 years are critical, and when I first wrote this presentation more than a month ago, little did I know that there'd be the announcement last week of what one might call a stretch target, but I'll come on to that in a moment. And what we're saying here is that the next 10 years are really critical to continue that journey of reducing greenhouse gases, and certainly from my own perspective, as a train operator, I have a very challenging target in my business's franchise agreement with the Department for Transport to reduce both traction and non-traction emissions. And just as an example, today we were actually looking at our year-end position with emissions, and we actually had a target of, compared to 15-16, reducing vehicles on a vehicle kilometre basis by 26%. And that actually, at the end of March, came in at 33%. So quite a significant reduction there, quite a significant contribution of which is decarbonisation of the grid, of which, I know there is more to come. But in terms of last week's announcement, last Thursday, the Committee on Climate Change, the challenge there was that, this original 80% reduction by 2050, a suggestion there that actually we can achieve 100% reduction for similar outlay in that timescale because of how innovation has actually driven down the cost of some of the key technologies, such as it states there, offshore wind and battery power. And certainly if you look at what the rail emissions trend has been over the last 10 or so years, you can see there that both for freight and particularly passenger, the emissions trend has actually been quite favourable. Now that is normalised by passenger kilometres, and whilst I've mentioned already the contribution that the decarbonisation of the grid has made to that, we shouldn't actually ignore the fact that we have seen a huge passenger growth on the UK rail network since privatisation. So depending upon what the metric being used is, that increase in passenger usage on the network is actually quite a significant driver to driving down emissions per passenger kilometre. I'm indebted to a railway division colleague, David Shearers, who may be known to some of you here, for this next chart, which you may have seen in a paper that he recently published. And the plea here is to ensure that we consider, in terms of traction source, energy source, the whole system effect. And I found this quite enlightening that, in the scenario of hydrogen power, diesel, or electrification from a renewable energy source, how much energy is actually required to deliver 1 kilowatt at the wheel. And the so-called well-to-wheel efficiency comparisons are quite stark there, particularly in relation to 3 times the amount of energy being required for a non-electrification source. So really interesting there as to how at each stage in the process the efficiencies have that quite dramatic impact in some cases as to what you actually need to get the kilowatt at the rail. I know David is going to be talking about the rail industry decarbonisation task force in a short while as well. And really what I wanted to do here was summarise some of the key findings from there as a result of the challenge that was laid down by the then Rail Minister Joe Johnson just over a year ago, I think, David, wasn't it now, as to how could the rail industry get rid of diesel-only passenger trains, emphasis on only there. This was not a challenge to get rid of diesel completely, but to get rid of diesel-only trains. And these were the key conclusions that came out from that rail industry decarbonisation task force in the initial report that was published in January of this year, talking about the best solution being a mix of new traction options and efficiency improvements, but very clearly, where it is cost effective and appropriate, electrification is most definitely the most carbon efficient power source. But it can't be a silver bullet, and as I know from my personal experience on the Great Western Railway with the electrification programme there, that level of investment can cause some quite significant disruption and delays to passengers. It also made the point that there is a very material difference between trial and full commercial production and I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of hydrogen in a while. But what is it that our customers want? So to answer this particular question, I turned to Transport Focus's research. So many of you will know that twice a year Transport Focus conduct a quite comprehensive piece of customer research called the National Rail Passenger Survey to gauge customers' perceptions on train service offerings from train operators. And this particular piece of research was included in a submission to the ongoing Williams review about the future of franchising within the industry, which was submitted a couple of months ago, and it really summarises the key priorities of what customers want. And you can see there from the top of the graphic, value for money is number one. But actually, in terms of things that we can readily influence as engineers, it's train capacity, it's punctuality, it's less disruption, and it's reduced journey time. So there are four particular things there that electrification can help with. But equally, the converse to that is that whatever we do by way of traction source selection, we should certainly not adversely impact capacity, punctuality, reliability, and journey time. And we really need to bear that in mind, particularly for some of the alternative energy sources when they can actually take up valuable space on a train that could be used by customers, but also potentially have an impact, adverse impact on acceleration and journey time, which itself could be an enabler for capacity in the form of running more services. Particular proud moment for me, just actually before I left Great Western to take up this particular role in the summer of 2017, was the initial extension of the electrification in the Thames Valley and some of the benefits that that delivered for not just the communities around that route, but also wider afield on the Great Western network, because not only did the electrification facilitate the introduction of brand new electric trains in the Thames Valley with all the benefits that go with that from a capacity, a performance perspective, but it also facilitated a cascade of what are actually quite scarce diesel trains elsewhere on the network where much needed, where there was a need for more capacity. And along the journey, it also allowed extension of a production line in Bombardier's factory in Derby to carry on running, that ultimately churned out over 2,800 vehicles over 15 or so years. One of the things that I've been really pleased to get hold of actually is a piece of research that Transport Focus did about a year ago, but it never actually got published. I think there might have been some better news out at the time, or maybe it was the difficulties the industry was facing in the aftermath of the May 2018 timetable change. But Transport Focus actually did a piece of research asking customers what they thought about attitudes towards train power and wider environmental credentials of rail. And you can see here that there are some enlightening numbers there in terms of, you know, an awareness that electric trains are actually better for the environment, but ultimately customers are a bit agnostic as to what's actually powering their train. Ultimately, it's about can they actually get there when we say we'll get them there with our timetable. There's a slide there about increasing use of trains as to what the drivers would be as to get more people to use our product, which is clearly good for the industry. And particularly enlightening were some of the comments here on views on train power. And clearly some of the people that they interviewed here are a little bit more informed than others, but a comment there about battery hybrid bimode technology is an expensive sticking plaster to mitigate failed electrification programs. But I guess a key point there, I have no preference as to pollution from generating electricity. Reliability is important. Electric trains are okay until they fail or the supplies fail. Then you need a diesel to drag them out of the way. And Ian referred to the Intercity Express trains, which of course do, as a consequence of having those diesel engines fitted to get onto the non-electrified parts of the network, do have that redundancy. But with diversity comes complexity, and that can sometimes mean lower reliability. So I think that has to be a key consideration in determining future strategy. And this particular chart came out of the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force initial report. And I thought I'd sort of use some real life train reliability figures to illustrate that point. And what I've done here through the reliability figures that are pulled together every 4 weeks by the Rail Delivery Group is look at how, for the different eras of trains, so legacy trains, ones that were built in the British Rail era, and then effectively 3 subsequent phases of new build within the 25 years since privatisation, culminating in what are called the Era 3 trains, which tend to be no more than a few years old and in many cases are still going through that initial reliability growth. But in all the cases, you can see that the miles per technical incident, that's the miles between any incident causing a 3 or more minute delay or indeed a cancellation, is significantly better with an electric train than it is a diesel. So typically, if you ignore those more modern trains that are still going through reliability growth, you are looking at an increase of at least double. And when the trains do go wrong, the delay per incident, which is in the lower table there, isn't actually materially different either. So, a real good example there as to why electric trains are better for customers. But of course, this is what we're battling against. So, a few months after the former rail minister laid down that challenge about removing diesel-only trains from the network by 2040, the very same rail minister was in early May last year saying that a national programme of electrification would be a waste of money. So that's the sort of thing that we're battling with here. But why are things so expensive? And I draw on a report that was published by the Institution of Mechanical Engineers back in January of this year, which in turn included a reference to electrification programmes that was originally published a year ago. And you can see there that that chart, I think, is quite telling when you look at the line that's on the chart, which is the production of electrified railway in single-track kilometres in Germany, which has remained remarkably stable for 50 years. And contrast that with the boom and bust of UK electrification. So the Institution of Mechanical Engineers made that conclusion in their report in January, that continental experience, and indeed that in Scotland, shows that electrification doesn't have to be excessively expensive if there's a long-term programme that encourages retention of skilled staff and application of standardised designs. And some of you in the room may know Bill Reeve, who has been quite instrumental in that Transport Scotland policy of electrification north of the border, and he's a former chair of the railway division of the IMechE. And just going back to the Committee on Climate Change, I found this particular statement about devolved administrations quite enlightening, that Scotland has actually been recognised as the leading UK nation in reducing those greenhouse gases, and certainly electrification is making its fair contribution to that, as I saw firsthand at the weekend when I was north of the border. I wanted also just to dwell here a moment on other power sources, and for those that aren't already aware of it, in the Institution of Mechanical Engineers we run a railway challenge competition every year, which is on the Stapleford Miniature Railway just outside Melton Mowbray the last weekend in June. And we have this year, I think it's 14 different teams from universities and industry actually building their own miniature locomotives, which have to be compliant with a specification that includes things like energy recovery, ride quality, and a new facet for this year, automatic train control. And last year, the competition was won by Ricardo, who were first-time entrants, and it was really interesting to see how Ricardo had fielded a mixed team of railway and automotive young engineers, and the application of technology there delivered a winning product first time out. And a number of years ago, actually, the University of Birmingham used a hydrogen-powered locomotive, which has been refined over the ensuing years. And it was demonstrated at Rail Live last June. And that has ultimately led to a collaboration between the University of Birmingham and Porterbrook, one of the rolling stock leasing companies, who are actually working now to create a Hydroflex former Class 319 unit, which I'm reliably told will be available for inspection at the Rail Live event next month. So a really good example there as to how, you know, an activity that was initiated within the institution of mechanical engineers has, you know, led to that collaboration between academia and industry. But, you know, we can do more with what we've got. And my business, as I said at the start, whilst predominantly electrified, we do have a fleet of around 110 diesel vehicles that work the non-electrified route west of Basingstoke down to Exeter and one or two other lines as well. And as part of our franchise commitment to improve our environmental credentials, we are doing something with those diesel trains as well. In this case, facilitated with some RSSB funding. Ourselves, Porterbrook, the leasing company, and Eminox are partnering up with some groundbreaking emissions reducing technology which will be rolling out on that fleet over the coming months. So in conclusion then, customers are largely agnostic to environmental credentials, but as the task force said, the first choice for decarbonisation really does need to be electrification. And I quoted some figures as to how decarbonisation of the grid has been a key contributor to reducing the emissions from my particular railway. But they can also support some of the wider industry objectives in terms of improved punctuality and reliability, greater capacity, and also reduced journey times. Bi-mode trains are not a silver bullet, and we need to be really, really mindful that diversity can lead to complexity, and that must not be, absolutely not, to the detriment of reliability. We have to factor into any plans how upgrading the network can impact on customers and stakeholders. You know, there is no gain without pain, but equally, you know, prolonged line closures do have a detrimental impact on the underlying financial position of the industry fare box. And the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, with that report that was published at the start of the year, made that recommendation that the UK government rethinks the cancellation of the electrification programmes and moves forward with a more innovative and longer term approach, perhaps replicating what we saw on that chart in terms of steady volumes that have been achieved in Germany over a number of decades. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm now going to hand over to David.
Thank you, Andy. Oh, better stand back from that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm David Clark. I'm the Technical Director at the Railway Industry Association, which, if you don't know, is the trade association for the supply chain. and I'm hoping I'm going to have some slides in a second. So while we're waiting for the slides to load up, what I'm going to talk about this evening, oh, here we go, is our Electrification Cost Challenge report. And the background to that I'll explain in a moment. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the strategy in the UK since 2007 or thereabouts. What emerged around about 2009, 2012 was a national electrification programme, which didn't entirely go well. And what did we learn from that? And to answer the question about what should electrification cost. And if I have time, I'll go on and touch on some of the other things that are in the report about benchmarking, how we got to establish what things cost, and also highlight some of the lessons learned from the projects that have gone well, and indeed the ones that have gone less well. So this is a little graphic trying to illustrate the policy changes since 2007. Now, you might look at this and think it's a poke at the government or government policy. Actually, it's not, as hopefully you'll see as we talk through. Actually, the reasons it's chopped and changed has been as much to do with how the industry has responded as it has been to government. So back in 2007, bottom left there was a white paper at the time called Delivering a Sustainable Railway, which conspicuously omitted electrification, any further electrification, which drove the industry in the shape of Adrian Shooter and Ian Coucher, if you're familiar with them, so formerly the head of the Rail Delivery Group as it is now, and Chiltern Railways, that's Adrian, and the Chief Executive of Network Rail, Ian. And they wrote to the government making the point that even if the white paper was saying there would be some miracle new technology coming along that would make electrification redundant, that was going to take quite a long time. And in the meantime, if we just got on and did some electrification, then we'd have maybe 10 or 15 years of benefits before this new technology came along. They also made the point, because it was being mooted at the time, that hauling around a mobile power station called a diesel engine is hauling weight and around, and that weight needs energy to move. So they started a debate which is still running now. And all credit at the time to the government, they actually listened to that. And by 2009, they'd got themselves around to writing another white paper which called for more electrification. And what it did in 2009, it did the sensible thing. It looked at where the fleets were being renewed, and I think you'll appreciate that the best time to electrify is when your existing diesel fleet is life expired. That's the once-in-a-generation opportunity you have to make a choice. And the two routes that were identified that were in that category at the time were Great Western and the northwest, well, Liverpool to Manchester, basically. By 2012 or thereabouts, as an industry and as government, we got so keen about electrification that we had about a dozen projects on that map in the middle. So we'd gone from 2 to about a dozen, and then we set off to start delivering them. And you'll see that graph at the bottom is the cost escalation on one project, Great Western, and I'll come back to that. That cost escalation led pretty directly to that news item about electrification of Midland Main Line paused by Network Rail. Now, actually, Midland Main Line hadn't even got started by then. It was paused because Great Western was not performing well, and they didn't want to start another main line until they'd understood what the issues were with Great Western. That led on to a National Audit Office report on Great Western, and it's never good to have a National Audit Office report on anything you're involved in, and that makes quite sobering reading about some of the issues on Great Western, which led on to, in 2017, the headline there about rail electrification plans scrapped by government. So that was stopping Great Western beyond Cardiff and not starting Midland Main Line. So actually, just to correct a little bit of a misnomer in some of the advertising for this event, you could have been mistaken for believing that it was stopped because Great Western and Midland Main Line were in difficulties. Midland Main Line wasn't in difficulties, it hadn't started. And I will talk a bit later about actually that's now delivering quite well. And ironically enough, we then move on, and as Andy's already mentioned, we've just stopped electrification, which it is our position is the best way to run an intensively used railway. We just stopped that in 2017, and in early 2018, the Minister of the day pops up and says, I want to decarbonise the network by 2040. I want rid of diesel-only trains by 2040. And that was in the space of relatively few months. So the question is, where do we move the policy to now? And as Andy has already alluded to, we want to try and get electrification back on the agenda as one of the options that should be considered in a decarbonisation strategy. So why did we set off doing this report? Why RIA? Why the Railway Industry Association? Well, frankly, the supply chain had ramped up to deliver a huge programme. That programme had then been curtailed, and our members were making lots of people redundant and curtailing their activities. RIA's in a position as a trade association where we can say it how it is, and we don't have contracts to lose, so we can stick our heads above the parapet and speak to clients and government in a way that our members can't. The key there, though, is we've got to be credible, so we've got to gather evidence, and we've got to be balanced in how we go about putting the argument. And what we wanted to do is to help the decision makers understand rail electrification. We wanted to do something about restoring government confidence in electrification, because actually I wouldn't disagree with Chris Grayling stopping Great Western as a problem project that cost was escalating on. What I would disagree with him about was condemning the technology, because effectively the way the messaging came out was electrification bad, we're not doing any more. And the issue actually was Great Western was in problems, so I think it was the right decision to pause, stop, and reassess Great Western. It wasn't the right decision to condemn a whole technology. And what we wanted to do, and we hope we've done in this report, is bring out the evidence that while some projects were going wrong, others were actually going quite well. And we'll show that the range of difference between the projects going badly and the projects going well is effectively means that the ones going well were costing a third to a half of the ones going badly. And we wanted to identify good practice to underline that and make projects more successful in the future, and call for a rolling programme, of which more later. Now, if any of this is of interest and you want to have a look at the report, if you go on our website and you go to, as it says there, bottom right, Press Office and then Publications, you can download a copy of it. What we're not doing here is pointing the finger at anybody, trying to allocate blame, because actually, as you'll probably see as we go along, there's no one party to blame here. As an industry, we were given a lot of work to do, and collectively we managed to make a muck of some of it. But I would emphasise, while some projects were going badly, many projects were successfully delivered. And you've seen a smaller version of that before. It started well, and as the Railway Industry Association, we're always obviously campaigning for additional work for our members. So what's not to like about a £4 billion programme of electrification over 5 years? Well, one of the things, and this is a slide from back in the day, and so this is not a criticism of people on the project. They understood some of the issues they were getting into, and as this slide shows, they clearly understood we were going from 200 million in the previous 5 years, which was basically upgrading West Coast and GE, to 4,000 million. Now, whatever it is you do for a living, that's a hell of a step up. And as you'll see in a moment, as we hadn't been doing any electrification for 20 years, it would have been quite a challenge to do the two projects I mentioned earlier, i.e. Great Western and Liverpool-Manchester. But as I said, we'd already got really, really keen, and we had those 10 or so projects that we had on the slates. So if you're short of resources and you spread your resources very thinly across a lot of projects, then that might cause some difficulties, which were recognised. They recognised the issues around skills, around resourcing, needing to ramp up, around learning best practice and spreading best practice, and about productivity. And they set out with a lot of good approaches to that. But some of the things weren't necessarily recognised or were learnt by bitter experience. There is a common rumour, or a common urban myth, if you like, that standards were a problem. Not in a big way. If you read the report, it's a bit of a red herring, and I'm happy to pick that up in Q&A. But what we were doing, and I'll come back to this, is we were introducing some new technology in terms of high output to drive productivity, and we were introducing it while we were trying to build the railway. We were accelerating from, as I've already mentioned, we had an issue around resourcing. The design was, and the program were immature at the point that it was, the first prices were named. And actually the other issue here, if you think about the classic time, cost, quality triangle, then because we had, as a nation, or we knew we were buying the trains and we knew they were coming in 2018, we'd fixed the time. We've effectively fixed the specification, and therefore the only other dimension that's going to move is cost. So a bit like, I think I heard Mark Wilder Crossrail saying just yesterday, that if you set a delivery date before you're totally clear about how you're going to deliver it, then problems might just ensue. Well, I'm there. Yeah, okay. And the contracting structure on Great Western at least meant that the incentives were not always well aligned. So what happened and what have we learned? Well, that illustrates the problem, and you've already seen that graph before, or part of it on the left-hand side. So that's the history of electrification since the 50s. You can pick out West Coast, East Coast, and then a 20-year gap, and then you go into all of this program that we were going to do in the in the 5 years just closing. So we were going to, from 20 years not doing anything in general terms, we were going to go and do 2,000 kilometres. So I would suggest maybe we weren't entirely realistic about the program, and we didn't have the experienced resource to do it. As I've mentioned, we were bringing in some novel technology. And there was a very good reason for doing this. The first major project, Great Western, obviously a main line. As Andy said, traffic is growing. You don't want to disrupt the passengers. So there's a very strong argument for driving productivity through a high output system. And the concept was plant and overhead line designed to be erected quickly overnight. And the issue, though, was because, as I've mentioned earlier, the end date was fixed. We ended up in the situation, and the sort of red bars on this timeline from 2014 illustrate the point very well. The system delivery improving, and any new system's going to have some teething troubles, that overlapped with the physical delivery of the works. Never a good position to get yourself into. And I'm not against innovation. Those of you who know me know that that sort of runs through me like a stick of rock. But the issue, and so when I say proven technology, it's not against innovation, it's making the point that do your innovation out of harm's way, not on a £1 billion project with a fixed delivery timeline. Now then, we might have got away with that, I think. We might have learned, with the teething troubles might have been ironed out, and we might have got away with it, but for an issue which is well known, I think, about the piles, which were the steel piles, which are the vast majority of the foundations, which was a fairly well understood technology. But there were two issues here. One was around the loading on the overhead line, because it had higher tensions, it was intended for higher speed, etc., and it was a new system, was thought to be higher than the loading that it was higher than the loading we'd been used before, and therefore it was thought to be beyond the range of the previous empirical approach to designing foundations. So we went away from an empirical approach for a period of time into a limit state design approach, and for those of you familiar with that sort of thing, you'll realize that limit state design and soil mechanics are not happy bedfellows, and you end up with some pretty conservative designs. So which ended up with much longer piles than you would have historically experienced. Then to add to the problem, and you can see the cable down the cess there next to the train. see how much further out the piles are. Note they're sticking out the ground because they were so long they wouldn't go in. Where they were intended to go in when the machine was specified is where the cable is. And most railway engineers would know that the cables on Great Western were mould ploughed in 30, 40 years ago. So the wisdom late in the day is let's not put the piles through the cables, but the plant had been specified to put them there. So those of you who deal with cranes will know that the duty chart tells you that if you're putting in a heavier load at further radius, the ability of the equipment to drive whatever it is, piles in this case, diminishes rapidly. So you end up with these piles. The illustration on the left is where it should have been putting the piles. So what happens is you end up with lots of pile refusals. Electrification is really a very simple process. You go out one night, you put a row of piles in, you give yourself a bit of a gap in case of any issues, and you come back another night, a few weeks or months later, you put some masts up, another few weeks, months later, you put the wires up. As soon as you start to have any gaps in your piles, you can't do the rest of the process. You should be down the line putting more piles in, you're coming back to fill in the gaps. Drives very poor productivity. Your plant can only be in one place at a time, especially if you've gone for a shiny piece of plant. You've only got the one. Which sort of drove this picture. I think, as you'll see later on, the 2009-2012 were quite immature estimates. The 2013 estimate is probably about where it should have been, because as you'll see later, that's the kind of cost that other things were delivering at. I think the reason for the escalation between 13 and 16 is in the orange and the blue bars, i.e. the overhead line and risk, and that basically represents the fact that in 2014 they were starting to put the piles in and were having all the problems that I've just reflected on. So I think 2016 is effectively the outturn cost of a project going wrong. So I would argue that you need to look at early collaboration and design development right at the beginning to mitigate those risks. Now then, when I talk to politicians about this, because we're having quite a conversation with a lot of politicians about this, I show them two graphs. I can convert the 60-odd pages of this report into two graphs, which they absolutely get. This is graph number one, and this is about cost. And there's about 20 projects on there. The orange represents numbers where the data is data that we and Network Rail agree on, and I must give credit where credit's due. Network Rail got behind this report and supported us in producing this report and shared some of the data that they had with us. So we can have confidence around those numbers. The blue numbers are numbers where, as Roger Ford says, we spoke to informed sources. And some of those are not in the UK. And the black blobs are projects that you'll probably have heard of that have experienced delivery difficulties. And what we see and what we conclude from our analysis is that there's two cost ranges that we think electrification should be delivered in. And just to explain what I mean here, for a unit cost, we've stripped out things that are highly variable and lumpy, like bridges, because you can come to a route where there's virtually no bridges and another one where there's lots of bridges. So what we're talking about here is the unit cost of the overhead line, the power, and the associated project management and prelims. So it's effectively the classic electrification cost. And what we see is that simple projects should cost and are costing $750,000 to $1 million per single track kilometre, and more complex ones between $1 million and $1.5 million. And in fact, the projects that got, in our view, nothing should be costing more than that. And quite a few of the ones that cost more than that are the ones that got into difficulties. And I think you'd want to be looking very carefully if you were looking at an estimate that was coming out at those anything above $1.5 million. And this is not saying to government and other stakeholders, if you give us this, this and that, and you give us another chance and we do all these innovation and improvements and so forth, we can deliver electrification for £1.5 million pounds per single track kilometre. It's pointing to real projects that have been delivered at that price. So it's not fantasy. What it's basically saying is when you do it well, you can do it for that price. When you do it badly, it costs a lot of money. So what we're saying is there's an efficient cost range, complexity is a driver of cost, and part of that complexity, as you'll appreciate on a busy railway, is access. The other graph I show them is the graph that Andy's already shown, and this is going back 50-odd years, and you see in the red bars the boom and bust of railway electrification in the UK. Now again, whatever it is you do for a living, if you see an order book profile like that, then it's very difficult to invest in people, plant, process, or just keep body and soul together as a business. Funnily enough, we've got graphs like that for pretty much every other discipline in the railway, including rolling stock and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So our point is, illustrated by the German line there, is that a steady rolling program of electrification reduces your costs. And I'll give you some. You may have noticed some of the German projects on the previous graph were at the bottom end of the range. Apparently, anecdotally, the Germans think that's lumpy, but we would love that. So I'm going to quickly spin through, in the few minutes I've got remaining, I'm just going to quickly spin through to give you a flavour of some of the data that we've got behind that. And I'm not going to touch on the Network Rail data because that's, unequivocally accurate from Network Rail sources. So I'm going to focus primarily on the other data. Here's one. Funnily enough, it's in Scotland, as Andy was mentioning. Here is a project that was being delivered at exactly the same time as Great Western was going wrong. They went about it in a very structured way, basically boils down to £1 million per single track kilometre. Here's another one, going abroad here, Denmark. Again, spookily enough, £1 million per single track kilometre when you do the conversion. And that was interesting in as much as, compared to Great Western, delivered in a very different way. More of an output specification to the supplier, more of a partnership, 10 years of work ahead of the supply chain. And you can see I've put a little sort of tick box or yes-no box against those sort of lessons that I mentioned earlier on each of those. Another one, this is one, to be fair, that hasn't yet been built, but here's one in Germany, €1 million per single track kilometre. Here is one that has been built, and this is just the overhead line. There's no power involved with this. But you know that well-known low-cost economy, Switzerland? Well, they're putting out the electrification at £305,000 per single track kilometre. And what's interesting, there's a video there that you can get on the internet, and they took 2 years to plan that. I think it was a 9-day closure. That's almost longer than we took to get into Great Western. Here's another one. Germany, again, not known as an especially low-cost economy, £375,000 per single track kilometre. And I would argue that both of those are examples of the benefit of a rolling programme. Coming slightly closer to home, back to these shores, recently finished Stirling, Dunblane, Alloa, £1 million per single track kilometre. So, that's the kind of data that we gathered. So they're not, it's not fantasy, the real projects that have been delivered. I'm going to flick through a few slides here which illustrate the lessons learned around the overhead line, the classic electrification, and I'm not going to speak on those because they're in the report. Because I'm going to talk about bridges for a second, because if you remember, we took the data, we stripped bridges out of our analysis, and bridges are 30 to 40% of the cost of that suite of projects. And what's really encouraging is there's been a lot learned about how to reduce the cost of bridge reconstruction. So here we come. So, what they're learning in Scotland, for example, is do it in advance. Get all your planning permissions out of the way, get that cleared away, do all your bridge works, and then come back, might be 2 years later, and do your electrification. And I'm going to skip forward a few more slides because there's a whole long list here of initiatives and innovations which are reducing the cost of electrification, cost of bridge reconstruction. But if I go to this one, which brings it all together quite neatly, you know, Network Rail have done a lot of good work in the latter year or so around minimising the cost of bridge reconstruction. And here is an example that was brought together by a collaboration between Network Rail, Andromeda, Siemens, GLS Coating, and the University of Southampton. And basically, you probably can't see that photograph terribly well, but there's a really, really constrained bridge at Cardiff where the canal goes underneath and the valley lines goes over the top. So, you know, reconstructing that was going to be hugely expensive. They estimated 40 to 50 million. And effectively what they did here is they demonstrated that by a combination of a number of techniques, surge arresters, which reduce the risk of flashover, insulated coating on the soffit of the bridge, and probabilistic gauging, they basically demonstrated you don't need to reconstruct the bridge. You can squeeze the wires through. Instead of 370 mil clearance, 20 mil clearance. And providing you don't want to re-gauge because you want to get freight through, which would be a perfectly valid thing to do, if you're trying to just get the wires through, then I would argue that there's a lot of bridges that might historically have been reconstructed which no longer need to be so. So I'm going to pause at that point.
Let's move the chairs to the middle.
Pick up your chair and walk.
Not very elegant. So, ladies and gentlemen, a cry from the heart, from the industry, from people who ought to know, because Andy and David have lived through electrification, and they've seen and spoken to the whole gamut of people throughout the industry, actually, who understand these things. And as David said, the idea of having a 6 megawatt power station at the front of a train that weighs 150 tons is not a great idea. And then it's only producing 2/3 of the power, say, of an equivalent electric locomotive, and it's polluting and it's noisy, and it's really not the way to go. Hydrogen, that's fine. The power density of hydrogen is so much less than is capable from ordinary fossil fuels or indeed from electric vehicles. And as Andy demonstrated, the loss of electricity on the way from wherever the electricity is sourced to actually tractive effort at the railhead is 3 times that of an electric train. So we needed to make, we felt, the message, and we'll be articulating this in great depth at our event on the 5th of June, and then taking it out to our regional centres. But what we want to do now is really hear from you, from the audience, and also from people who might be logged in elsewhere, and actually get a proper discussion going on some of these hard industry-wide issues. I think I'm going to hand the first question to colleagues from Midland Main Line, to Simon and John, because that did come up in the conversation. I'm famously a Forest fan, and I love the East Midlands. I lived in the East Midlands for the first part of my career. No laughter about Forest, by the way. But the ludicrous situation of the wires reaching as far as Corby or Kettering or Market Harborough, and then not actually reaching the conurbations in Derby, Leicester, Nottingham and Sheffield is something that really we have to collectively as a society, I think, deal with. And so we wanted to give you guys a chance to articulate your view of what's happened and the future plans as well.
Thank you. My name's John Merriman. I'm the DP for Midland Main Line, working for Network Rail. The project at the moment is below budget and ahead of programme. We've got approximately a year to go before we enter into service. There are a lot of challenges in front of us, but we've got a really strong team. One of the issues I'd like to bring up with you is we're around about 1.6 million per STK at the moment. Overall electrification cost is around about the 280 million. Total project cost, including signalling, P-way, bridge clearance, tunnel works, is just shy of £1 billion. So as a percentage, we're some 18 to 20% of project cost. I can understand selling 1.5 million per STK is a good news story. Sadly, our rail infrastructure is dated from 1840 onwards, and there, on many routes, are those big challenges about infrastructure works that need to be marshalled and done. And a lot of the reoccurring costs, I believe, that our colleagues are seeing around the nation are managing other infrastructure, working across disciplines, competing contracts on the same route. And we've taken from those lessons, and we've learnt lessons, and we've applied a strong integration team within Midland Mainline, and we're still learning lessons as we go on. But I think you need to pause and have a look at some of the peripheral costs that hit projects quite hard.
So Andy, I think I'm going to ask you really, I guess, if you can cast your mind back to the time on Great Western and thinking about the costs that carting diesels up and down the Great Western main line, plus the slower journey times and everything else, and the on costs of having a hybrid rather than a completely electric railway. And how that looks from an operator's perspective, because there's an infrastructure perspective, but there's also 40 years of use of these assets.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, you know, if we cast your mind back as to the presentation with David and the various milestones, you know, the original expectation was that a substantial proportion of the intercity express train fleet would actually be notionally electric only, with one vehicle with a diesel engine for getting out of trouble and hotel power during isolation. So, you know, one of the NIO bits that was you know, made very clear in their report was, you know, that the cost of electrification challenges on Great Western was not just about electrification per se, it was the various variations that were required to the rolling stock type. But that's I guess a legacy that the industry is now lumbered with until such time as someone has the confidence to say that we don't need those diesel engines anymore because there's enough electrification. I guess the perverse thing with this is, having made that decision to fit more diesel engines, it almost became the justification for not doing any more electrification beyond which was committed. The point I'd make there in terms of other assets, just a couple of sort of real life examples. I think the importance of future-proofing whenever infrastructure is being upgraded, and much of what went on Great Western was linked to planned signalling upgrades. So signalling upgrades signalling renewals were required. In fact, one of the sort of reasons why the wires haven't got to Oxford yet is because of that inherent linkage between re-signalling, track remodelling, and wanting to do it all as a bundle rather than doing something first that then needs to be retrospectively revisited. Reading Depot is a really good example. When I first went to Great Western in 2007, Reading Depot was a solution to the problem of grade separation west of Reading, and was specified as a diesel-only depot. The pain that we had to go through to get that depot specified to accommodate overhead line at some later date and not have to be, you know, closed down for quite significant modifications literally within a year of it opening was actually quite something. And I think that was a hard-fought battle there, on the basis that it was originally specified as a like-for-like replacement for the depot that was being bulldozed to facilitate the construction of the new flyover. And I recall going to a sort of IMechE talk with colleagues from Chiltern as to some of the issues there, as to ensuring that the Bicester to Oxford line, when that was upgraded, which of course was a bit of the railway that Great Western used to run over before Chiltern took over the service, as to making sure that that was ultimately built with future electrification in mind. So I think that importance of future-proofing, really good point.
Can I quickly pick up a couple of points? Because I agree with John that you, I mean, coming at it from a slightly different direction, I'm not suggesting that you electrify for the sake of electrification. When you electrify, you should be looking at the route improvement opportunities and the future-proofing that Andy's alluding to. So we're not saying that you can do a route, you can do the wires, the power and the OLE for £1.5 million or thereabouts per single track kilometre. But the point we're trying to make is that electrification as a technology had got a bad reputation. Route improvement hadn't got a bad reputation necessarily. It was electrification. Whether the label's right or not is another issue. And if you look at just the numbers of purely the electrification element, lots of projects costing £1.5 million or less, a bunch of projects costing 2 or 3 million per single track kilometre. And Great Western, for example, to illustrate the point, from memory, was about 2.5 or 2.6 per single track kilometre just for the electrification. It was 4 million per single track kilometre by the time you put in everything else. Your point's well made. The other thing I'd say about I know you're doing on Midland Main Line is you're delivering a productivity at a level that the high output plant was intended to deliver. You're delivering that productivity on a midweek night in the kind of windows that Great Western should have been able to deliver, but you're delivering it with conventional plant and you're just banging it out every night, which shows that it can be done.
Okay. So I'd love to see the wires get all the way up ultimately to Sheffield, and let's hope that one day happens. Have we got another question? The more pointed, the better. There's the lady there in the striped jumper, I guess.
I have two questions to Andy. First of all, you mentioned that the carbon per passenger improved, but is that not just because of overcrowding? And by reducing overcrowding, you would increase your carbon per passenger. And the second one is something which wasn't mentioned at all, third rail, question mark?
So, Andy, yeah, if you just get more people off squeeze them in, and that's going to solve the carbon problem.
Well, I think that's probably been the challenge of the last sort of 20 years. If you look at ridership on my part of the network, there's been sort of colossal increases, sort of doubling in 20 years, and the capacity interventions have happened quite late in the day. So I think actually on a vehicle kilometre basis, we have already put in a lot of additional capacity, which sort of does affect the profile. But ultimately, having done that, the people continue to want to travel with us. So every time there is a capacity intervention, it does affect that metric. But I think over the long term, there has been that improvement. It's not all been about overcrowding either. I mean, I'd point to the fact that we've got a relatively old fleet that will be retired in a few years' time, with new trains coming along that have actually been retractioned to provide better performance and better environmental credentials, because they've now got regenerative capability. And also, as more modern trains come on the network, they are much more intelligent. So particularly hotel loads can be reduced with overnight stabling and all that sort of stuff. So it does help our environmental credentials. But certainly, the point about the number of passenger kilometres, if that's the normalising factor, then yes, there is. The more people travel, the better that metric becomes, until such time as you make an intervention in providing more vehicles.
I mean, we looked at this on the underground extensively. One of the things that people need to recognise is, particularly with 25 kV railways, they're already pushing up to the physical limits of efficiency. So it's not like a car, say, or a hydrogen vehicle, which wastes 60% or 70% of the primary energy. In railways, it's actually quite a low number. David, do you want to get...
There was a question about third
rail
as well.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, shall I just while you think about the third rail point? I I get your point about overcrowding, but if you look at an electric train, it's zero carbon and zero emissions at the wheel. And what we see in the decarbonisation of the grid is clearly going to benefit further. So the carbon in today's electric train is actually at the power station. So as the grid is progressively decarbonised, and as we saw last week, the Climate Change Commission are looking for it to be effectively net zero carbon by 2050, then electric trains just get better. If you have more trains, then you address the overcrowding problem. If there are more electric trains, they are zero carbon. And to put the challenge of decarbonising the network into perspective, today there's about 14,000 vehicles on the network. Only 3,000 of those are diesel. So in the scheme of things, that's a number that you can start to deal with. And we mentioned the Decarbonisation Task Force before, of which I'm a member. We'll be publishing our final report in the summer. And I'm expecting that that's going to make a strong argument for electrification, and it's going to make a strong argument also for electrification, I should say, on the intensively used parts of the network, and it's also going to make a strong argument for other low carbon options on the less intensively used part of the networks. And we can certainly see ways that the rail industry can decarbonise by 2050.
So your question about third rail was?
So why not more? Yeah. Do you want to pick that? Do you want me to pick that up? Or? Third rail DC is, less energy efficient, and the current technology. We would have an issue with Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate around safety of the public if we extended today's third rail system. So that's not to say we couldn't and maybe shouldn't extend the third rail system, but if we do, we're going to have to do something to perhaps shroud the rail or whatever to protect the public.
I think it's quite an interesting one. In my former life at Great Western, we have a route on the North Downs that goes from Reading to Gatwick, where about a third of the mileage on that route is already electrified with third rail, where it crosses sort of other routes. And I remember, having quite a dialogue with ORR about the merits of infill third rail electrification, and ultimately we were not able to get to a viable solution there, which is why the Porterbrook 319, now 769 product is going to be rolled out on that route, where it will make use of the third rail where it's provided, but there will be diesel power available for filling in the gaps.
So as I guess an underground person, I think there's a lot to be said for third rail electrification, fourth rail electrification as well, and the North London line and Thameslink are both examples of routes which use both, of course. So flexing with modern traction packages, that's much easier than it used to be. It's better than diesels, and I think once again a practical analysis rather than an ideological analysis is what we need with railways, and also long-term perspective. Anyway, that's just me. What about the audience?
Thank you, Tony Fradley. I'm a forward-thinking person, so my question is, and I'm positive as well, my question is political. So looking forward and futuristic, right, what are we doing with regards to an SRA Mark II?
Well,
I think you'll have to ask Mr. Williams about that. So those who are, sort of involved in the rail industry, you'll know that the mainline rail industry is currently got a review going on to look at the structure of the industry and how it's best taken forward. There certainly seems to be, the mood music seems to be, there would be, use any phrase you like, but some kind of guiding mind, some sort of arm's length thing to, frankly, take government out of the micromanagement of the railway. We're going to have to see how that plays out, but the mood music is pointing towards something of that sort.
So maybe I can sort of ask a follow-up question on the back of that excellent question, which is, in your views, the pair of you, do you think that if such a body had existed at the time of Great Western mainline electrification, would it have forestalled the problems that we encountered?
Not unless it had the authority to say that we need longer to develop our plans, that summer 2018, we don't yet know whether we can deliver it. And by the way, we should stage those other 8 projects that you want to do over a number of years. In other words, so that there was more of a ramp up rather than a massive leap in volume. So if it's a good question actually, because a test for such an organisation is that they would be able to stand up to the understandable political desire to be improving the railway. I mean, you can't really fault politicians back in 2009 for wanting to spend money on the railway. The railway, the industry needs to be able to manage their expectations about how quickly it can be delivered. And if that organisation could have those tough conversations and manage upwards to the politicians, then it could be successful.
So, and did you think there's going to be a guiding mind that's got more of a guiding mind than the RSSB and RIA? And
transport is a
LPG?
devolved matter in Scotland, and they have Transport Scotland, and that seems to have delivered against many of those tests that David's just outlined.
Can I just come back on that?
By all means.
Transport for Scotland have got a pot of money. Transport for the North and others haven't got the money. They have to keep going back to the Treasury for the money. And the other thing that worries me, and I didn't want to mention the B word, Brexit, but we haven't got room in the statutory implementation in Parliament to introduce a second SRA, I would suggest, because of Brexit and everything else.
Well, there's something to chew on.
And on that happy note.
Well, I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, what we can do in this
questions.
room is solve the future of railway electrification policy. However, I doubt we're going to be able to deal with Brexit.
We managed to get 20 minutes in, though, before the B word got mentioned, so thanks, Toby.
Richard Melville, Cellularity. 2 things. I thought one of the major problems with Third Rail was leaves on the line. The other thing I wanted to raise, probably it's a bit of a tangent, but early on Andy said that it was very difficult to get any sort of efficiency to the wheels of the locomotive. Wouldn't a better means of transport then be a train that hovers? And I think they have some in Japan.
Okay, so leaves on the line, what I can say absolutely with certainty is that the leaves on the line issue doesn't affect the electrification, it affects the wheel rail interface of the running rails. Overhead lines are subject to being blown down in high winds and all sorts of things. So, I mean, I guess you two can comment, but I'm more interested to find out what you think about hover trains, to be honest. Let's start with you. Is the Railway Industry Association going to be sponsoring maglev or hover trains or any other radical technologies anytime soon?
Well, the maglev, and the premier example is going to be the Tokyo to Osaka line that Japan's building. They're building that because their existing high-speed line is full to absolute capacity. And basically they're tunneling 500 kilometers in a dead straight line, putting a tunnel in, putting a maglev in it. The power demand of a maglev is an order of magnitude greater than a conventional train. So if we're trying to reduce energy, because it's got to be generated somewhere, then maglev wouldn't be my first choice. I think I'd start with a conventional high-speed line or a conventional railway generally. And when I think that just purely from an energy point of view, maglevs are not terribly efficient.
So indeed, I think I made the point earlier, one of the things about conventional railways is just how durable and efficient the technology really is with low rolling resistance and so on.
And it just occurs to me as well, another version of a maglev in a vacuum called a hyperloop. I've not yet seen a clear description of how that will work as a transport service. For instance, if you go on, I think it's Hyperloop One's website, and they talk about how they're going to move 800 people an hour from San Francisco to LA at 750 kph. Yeah, so that sounds all great, but 800 people an hour, that is, you'll get 1,000 people in a high-speed train, and we're planning 24 of those an hour.
Right, exactly. And I think the Hyperloop people also, if I may add, I've forgotten about the stations at either end of the Hyperloop. If you look at the land area that Euston Station, particularly the extended station with HS2, takes up, and try and multiply that with a bunch of tubes, because these trains have to stop to detrain the passengers, presumably, unless there's some other magic.
Well, how long does it take to stop it from 700 kilometres an hour? And how do you get out of a tube in a vacuum?
Indeed. Okay, so having
slight digression.
Unless Andy's got the answer.
I was just going to say, the top contact third rail system, it's not leaves on the line, it's ice formation, for which there are some mitigations. But one of the things on our network, helpfully, is the ability to run longer trains now as well is quite useful there as well.
So, yeah, we've got another question now. I think there's two questions in a row there. So we'll take the person with the microphone first.
Hi. Electrifying a diesel line introduces new risks for the people working, especially the maintainers. In the Wessex, which is predominantly a third rail environment, we've started introducing short-circuiting devices, which eliminates the use of strapping teams completely. So do the current electrification projects for the OLE hold the capacity for such safety improvements, or is that something, once it's all done, we go back for more money to make safer what we've just installed?
Well, it's not my specialist subject, but what I do know is that in the specification of the current electrification schemes, there's a lot of being built in to improve the approach to remote isolation, and we're getting towards the point where we're out there with new SCADA systems and new which enable a robust app-based process rather than a paper-based process. The traditional way of protecting yourself as a member of staff is having waited for an hour for somebody to put up the earths. You then sign a piece of paper and you speak to the electrical control room. Well, all of that is being digitized into an app and remotely. So you, as the person on site, have the lock on through your encrypted app rather than the person that you're speaking to on the phone in the electrical control room. So there's a lot of modern technology being brought in to improve exactly that.
Okay.
And I think anything as well as improving safety, if it's something that can improve productivity and mean that the same amount of work can be done in less time, possessions can be used more effectively, challenges about wanting to run trains later at night and earlier in the morning. All of that, has got a demonstrable benefit for other aspects of the railway system as well as just safety.
So there was another question there at the front, and I'll also ask our people monitoring
the gentleman with the blue shirt at the back as well.
Okay, and because we're getting timed out presently, but we'll also see if there's any questions coming on YouTube or so much for the internet. Well, great. Okay.
Hi, my name is Rohel Rafi. I'm from Atkins. What do we do about the east-west corridor conundrum? So Britain's passenger railways are built to go from north to south. Currently, it takes longer to get from Cambridge to Oxford than it does from London to Newcastle, which is 3 times less the distance. So in terms of policy and influencing the government, what can we do on that east-west corridor, which is presumably going to see a higher demand in the future? And the east-west rail project is basically a diesel railway now.
So I guess, David, the east-west railway, having worked in Milton Keynes for a while, passes sort of nearby at Bletchley, doesn't it? And it passes over any number of 25 kV AC railways radiating out of London, and yet the economic heart of the country is going to be served even after billions of pounds of expenditure with diesels.
Well, that's a really good example of why we're trying to do this, why we've done this report, to sort of try and kill the myth that electrification per se is expensive and inefficient and no longer needed. So as I said earlier, we're trying to rebuild the confidence in decision makers. Frankly, they don't have the confidence in the rail industry to deliver on time and to cost at the moment. We're slowly rebuilding that. I think one of the things that will help us is the decarbonisation agenda, because it's said, I think I said, back in 2009, the reason to electrify a railway was because it was the more cost-effective way to run your railway. It's still that, but it now has the decarbonisation agenda is much higher. There's a timing issue here, but I think if we are consistent in our argument and carry on with engaging with government and decision makers, then we will slowly swing the dial back towards favouring electrification on the intensively used routes. Whether they go east, south, north, or west.
Okay, so I'm going to ask for, I guess, one more question. There was one, wasn't there? You've got the microphone.
Hi there, it's Mark Spurgeon from Bedford. In Bedford, we've got the Midland mainline electrification. We've got a highly disruptive rebuilding of a railway bridge just to gain 320 millimetres. And I was very interested to hear what you had to say, where the average clearance should be, I think, was it about 170 millimetres, but in Cardiff they'd got it as low as about 20 to 25 millimetres. So I have to ask the question first to David and also possibly to the guy from the Midland Mainline Electrification Programme. Why isn't that being done in Bedford instead of spending over £5 million and I think about 18 months rebuilding a railway bridge, which I suspect is now going to be on the critical path for the whole electrification? Because if I look north of Bedford, the overhead gantry is actually in place, and yet they can't complete it, they can't do driver testing because of this railway bridge.
So it would perhaps be appropriate for you, John, to take that, if we can get the microphone down.
I mean, while we're getting the microphone to John, I mean, I don't know the specifics of that, but there's a trade-off to be made. If you go for the kind of solution that I talked about in Cardiff, there's long-term trade-offs in terms of maintenance and so forth. So you're trading off the asset management issues over the long term. You're precluding the use of freight through there. And so you have to look at any particular structure in a holistic way. But if it was the difference between having an electrified line and not having an electrified line, that's the time to have those sort of trade-off discussions.
Hi, sorry. I'm Simon Skinner, I'm the CEM, the Contractors Engineering Manager for Midland Mainline. So I'm the contracting part of the route. So I'm responsible for construction, the electrification, including design. So I know a little bit about your bridge. It's Bromham Road, I believe, which is just north of Bedford Station. Just south of Bedford Station, sorry. So, north. Is it north? There is actually as equally a political bridge south of Bedford Station, which is also on the critical path, Fordane Road Bridge. Yeah. So the technology we discussed associated to the Cardiff wasn't in play at the time of our implementation. There's also a legacy issue associated with what we call route clearance. All the 49 bridge interventions we got on the project was very much a sort of like 2012-13 approach. So they were progressing on the interventions whilst electrification was paused, or if not cancelled. We then restarted the programme of works, and that meant that we couldn't influence as much as we could have done, and applied the sort of types of technology we're discussing today. So it's a lost opportunity for legacy route clearance interventions, but not for the future. Does that answer your question? Ish.
So electrification clearly is expensive, but you know, after not having diesel trains thundering through Bedford at 3 or 5 diesel trains an hour thundering through Bedford, you know, in perpetuity has to be a prize that's worth having. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, it probably is now time to draw the event to an end. Once again, Zen, let me thank you for inviting us to the heart of the beast, mechanical engineers, to that IET, and we're glad to have been able to discuss this important issue with you tonight.
Thank you very much, Ian. And, nearly on time. I know how much you appreciate the networking reception for the networking opportunities and the discussion. Nothing to do with the wine. So I hope you'll agree with me. Our speakers made a clear case for a rethink on railway electrification policy. We've heard an operator's perspective as well as the Railway Industry Association's view on cost management. A compelling case that our speakers intend to continue promoting, as you heard from Ian earlier about the day seminar at the IMEC. It's June the 5th, isn't it?
June the 5th, yeah.
On June the 5th. It's been a pleasure having our colleagues from RIA and the IMEC making a case for electrification here at the IET, and a good demonstration that the IMEC operating under the umbrella of the IET is not such a bad thing. Yeah. So seriously though, I'd like to thank Andy and David for affording us their time tonight and sharing their views and experience from recent projects. I'm also grateful to Ian for his help in actually organizing the event tonight and the excellent chairmanship. So we've got a small memento here. I think, Ian, you'll complete your set now.
Yeah, probably.
Can't remember how many years ago it was that you've done your last presentation.
Well,
Yeah.
no longer, I tell you, the best thing about no longer working for a corporate is I no longer have to fill in a form when I get these pens or whatever the hell they are.
So,
but you two are going to have to fill in your compliance forms.
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I've only got a little one.
So just a couple of announcements before we break off. Our next event here is our Friday lunchtime lecture on May the 31st on cyber security monitoring. We have a luncheon at 12:30 and the lecture begins at 2 o'clock. So the registration, you can register on our website, and we've got more information there about the event. And our next evening lecture is on June the 12th. So you're going to have to watch out again for our email invite on the topic for the night. I haven't got the details tonight. So we'll continue discussion on electrification policy over a glass of wine upstairs. Everybody is welcome, so I hope to see you all there. All right, good night and travel safely.